Our gospel reading for this second Sunday in Lent comes to us from the Gospel according to Luke, the 13th chapter, verses 31 through 35. If you'd like to follow along in your pew Bibles, I would invite you to do so at this time. It can be found on page 849. Let's all listen for God's word to us today. At that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, 'Listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time comes when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our text for this morning is about the sorrow of Jesus. If you were following along in your pew Bible, there is a heading over the text itself. That heading reads, "The Lament over Jerusalem." That was not in the original Greek. An editor inserted those words, but I would say it's pretty accurate. Today's text takes place when Jesus knows that he will go to Jerusalem and will be killed in Jerusalem, and he wishes that he could change the hearts and the minds of the people in Jerusalem. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem," he cries, "the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together, and you were not willing." Our text for today is about the sorrow of Jesus. But truth be told, I'm not sure I want to spend time with the sorrow of Jesus this morning. Why? Well, maybe it's because of all the sorrow that's going on in the world right now. Just shy of 1 million COVID deaths in our country, a war in Ukraine that's killing innocent civilians by the hundreds and creating refugees by the millions. Do you see what I mean? Start naming the sorrow, looking squarely at the sorrow, and before too long, you want to turn away from the sorrow. Dr. Sunita Puri is a palliative care doctor who recently wrote about a wife who was grieving the loss of her husband. "I could not offer her easy answers," she writes, "only a willingness to stay and listen. She shared photos of her husband over Zoom. They had sailed and cooked and taken selfies on the beach. Earlier in my career," she says, "looking closely at this particular kind of pain was as blinding as the sun. I distracted myself afterward with Saturday Night Live marathons and slabs of chocolate cake. Eventually," she says, "I realized that it was not my job to protect people from their grief. I have learned to look when I want to look away. I have chosen to stay when I'd prefer to run out of the room and cry. The prelude to compassion," she says, "is the willingness to see." What is it then that Luke wants us to see when he turns our attention today to the sorrow of Jesus? Luke's not the only gospel writer who does this, after all. Each of the gospels have their own scenes of the sorrow of Jesus. Do you recall the shortest verse in the Bible? Shortest verse in the Bible. When Jesus is invited to visit the tomb of his friend Lazarus. John chapter 11, King James Version. I saw a couple of you mouthing it to yourselves. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible is about the sorrow of Jesus. Then there's the last night of his life, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew and Mark both report that on that night, Jesus began to be distressed, agitated. He says to his disciples, "I am deeply grieved, even unto death." All four Gospels invite us in one way or another to spend time with the sorrow of Jesus. But I'm still not sure that I really want to do it. Maybe the reason I don't want to do it is not so much an awareness of the world's sorrow, but an awareness of our own sorrow. You see, when you and I start looking more closely at the grief of Jesus, it is an invitation to look closely at our own grief, at our own loss, and dealing with loss of any kind, a death, a move, a divorce, or even just the natural transitions that we go through in life, the kids leaving home, our health starting to fall apart. Any kind of loss can be a confusing and uncontrollable experience. And so we fear it, right? We don't like dealing with loss. We tend to avoid looking at loss. I recall when my family had moved to Dallas 12 years ago, we had a couple of very young kids in tow, and we bought a house. The home was built in 1954. It still had the original glass windows, which meant it wasn't up to speed. It wasn't meeting the requirements of modern homes. So we decided to replace those windows, and a pair of guys came out to do the work. But during the course of the job, we noticed that one of the workmen was missing part of his index finger. Half of it was gone, and he was really friendly, so I wasn't bashful. I asked him what happened to his finger. "Oh, I lost part of it on the job," he told me. "It was a couple years ago. I had been dating my girlfriend, who's now my wife. I'd been seeing her for about 7 or 8 years. She really wanted to get married. I kept hemming and hawing around. She was getting tired of my waiting, but I finally summoned up the nerve to ask her to marry me, and she said yes. Well," he went on, "I was so excited. The next day I went to work, and all I could think about was getting married to her. And I was distracted, and I had to saw a piece of wood to make a window fit right, and I wasn't paying attention, and shoop, off went part of the finger." Of course, he said, I'll never forget her response. "I went to the ER, called her from the ER, told her not to panic. I had just lopped off part of my finger, but it would all be okay. And," he said, "I expected, a little sympathy. Where are you? What hospital? This is awful. I'll be right there." "No, that's not what my fiancée said." She paused, and then she said to me, "It better not be your ring finger, Buster." Now, what was that? A humorous response, to be sure, but below the humor, can you hear it? The fear of losing what's most important to her, of what she's looking forward to, just falling apart. Do you know what the two most common questions are that I hear from our congregation these days? How's our giving, and how's our worship attendance? In other words, are we gaining ground or losing ground? Did the pandemic change us? Were the past 2 years just a bump in the road? Or did we lose something that we're never going to get back? When Norman Maclean wrote about the death of his brother in A River Runs Through It, Maclean recalled his father's reaction. Over and over, his father wanted to know everything he could know about how his younger son came to lose his life. "Are you sure you've told me everything you know about his death?" asks his father. "Everything," replies Norman. "It's not much, is it?" says his father. "No," replies Norman, "but you can love completely without complete understanding." Some of the wisest words I know, and it sounds in some ways like Norman Maclean's response to his father, was a sign that he had come to terms with the loss of his brother. And yet, in an interview years later, Norman Maclean's own son, John, recalls what it was like growing up with his dad, with Norman Maclean, and how sometimes his dad, when he did not think anyone else was around in the house, would just cry out the name of his brother, Paul! He would shout to what he thought was an empty house. Paul! It was a loss that haunted Norman Maclean his entire life. So maybe that's it. Maybe it's my own fear of loss that makes me not want to preach on this text about the sorrow of Jesus. Or maybe this is it. Maybe it's because of the way our text describes that sorrow. In the 13th chapter of Luke, Jesus, you see, just seems to have it all together. Yes, he laments over the people of Jerusalem, but he just seems to have it all figured out. He says, I am casting out demons and performing cures today, tomorrow, and on the third day I finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. One does not get the sense that there's any hesitation in Jesus, any struggle in Jesus, any fear of losing his life that's in Jesus. I am much more inclined to look at the sorrow of Jesus when he's actually entered Jerusalem during that last week of his life. Do you remember how Luke describes it? Jesus in the garden. When Luke tells us that Jesus asked God, remove this cup from me, and in his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. That is the kind of sorrow that resonates with me, because grief does not come to us as a controllable, moderate experience. Grief often hits us unexpectedly as an overwhelming experience. And yet, the more I think about it, the more grateful I am that Luke portrayed Jesus' sorrow in differing ways. Facing loss like he's got it all together in chapter 13, and then in chapter 22, arguing with God about the loss he knows he'll suffer, and he's unable to keep it all together. When you look closely at the sorrow of Jesus, Jesus himself seems to fluctuate. He goes from moving forward in courage and faith to begging with God to help him with his faith. And that all sounds about right to me, because all of us, I think, when it comes to loss, fluctuate. We all need help when it comes to moving through the losses that life brings. We're not meant to make it through the losses in life on our own. For example, how many of you recall Psalm 23? How many of you could say it by heart to yourself right now? Yes. Our children have sung it beautifully earlier in our worship service today. It is a psalm of comfort, a psalm of hope. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. Do you remember the next verse? Yea, though I walk around the valley of the shadow of... Wait a minute, that's not it. Yea, though I skip right by the valley of the shadow of death. No, that's not it. Help me out here, will you? Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's right. Through the valley, thou art with me. The psalmist knew long ago that when we go through the valleys of life, we need someone else with us. We need God with us, because we cannot make it through the valleys on our own. When I was 12 years old, my grandmother died. She was the first grandparent in my life to die, the first time that I had really encountered death in a life-changing way. Shortly after her death, my father took me to see what was then a popular and recently released movie, Places in the Heart. Set in Waxahachie, Texas, at the height of the Depression, the film is remembered among many for its closing scene. Early in the film, a young African-American man accidentally shoots and kills the local sheriff, and in retaliation, that young man is lynched by a mob of white residents in the town. In the closing scene, a church in that town gathers for worship on a Sunday morning. The sheriff's family is there, and during communion, the tray is passed from person to person, each one offering the elements and saying to the next person, the peace of God. But as the camera follows the people sharing communion, it moves from those who are alive to those who have died. And the ones who have died are now alive in that scene, sitting with the living, sharing communion with them. The sheriff who was shot passes the peace of God to the young man who killed him. It's a moving scene of God's kingdom, a vision of God's power over death itself. But what I remember most about that movie is what my father said to me as we walked to the car when the movie was done. As we were going there, he said, "Ben, that last scene, that's what your mom and I believe has happened to your grandmother. We believe she is alive right now, in communion with God, worshiping God, giving thanks and praise to God." In other words, it had been a few months, but my father knew I was still grieving my grandmother's death. And he was not telling me to get over that grief or to move on from my grief. He was telling me that in the love and grace of God, my grief for my grandmother was not all there was. He was telling me that God's love was even stronger than my grief, even stronger than death itself. Now, I don't think I could tell you any other conversation I had with my dad when I was 12 years old. But I remember that one. Why? Because my father was walking with me, willing to travel through the valley with me. Here I am, almost all the way through this sermon, and I think I am finally ready to spend a little time with the sorrow of Jesus. Why? Well, not because Jesus' sorrow reminds me of my own sorrow, and not because it reminds me of the world's sorrow. I think I'm ready to spend time with his sorrow because it reminds me of the people who have walked through the valleys of life with me, and it is in those people, at those moments, that you and I see the risen Christ. The retired pastor John Walton once visited a parishioner in the hospital who had just been diagnosed with lymphoma. It was advanced, there was no cure. This elderly woman then said to her pastor, "I wish you'd been here earlier. The doctor came to see me with 3 handsome young interns in tow. He said to me, maybe you would like to share with these young men something that they should know as doctors, especially in light of your faith and what I've just told you." Well, she said to her pastor, I hardly knew what to say. It seemed like it was so important. Here I was in bed, and I was supposed to say something that these young doctors could remember. I didn't think I had anything to say. So I just said, somehow, I trust that whatever happens to me, I will be in God's hands. And that gives me hope. She looked at John Walton and said, I wish you'd been here. You would have said it so much better than I could. And the Reverend Walton looked back at her and said, no, I couldn't. I couldn't have said it any better at all. And neither can I. You know why I finally decided to preach on this text? Because of you. See, I have never met anyone in this life who has loss and grief and sorrow all figured out. But I have met you, and some of you have gone through corridors of grief that I have never had to walk through. Some of you have faced unspeakable loss with such courage and such faith. And even when all that happened, you kept showing up. You kept being here for one another. You kept coming back to this sanctuary to sing God's love and to give God's praise. You are the reason that I preached on this text, because when I look out at you, I see the gospel truth, that God's love is greater than any loss that we will ever face, that God's love shows up in the gift of one another, that whatever happens in this life, you and I will be in God's hands, and we will see the risen Christ in each other. That gives me hope. And I trust it also does for you.